Okay, buckle up because we are diving headfirst into some really fascinating stuff today. We're talking declassified sections of the UK's Iraq Inquiry Report.
We're not getting into the political weeds of it all.
No, no politics. We're interested in the human experience at the heart of it.
How did British troops manage, cope, survive, you know, through years of conflict in Iraq? That's what we're looking at.
It's about the soldier's experience.
And what I find fascinating is how this inquiry, they really went there. They didn't shy away from asking those tough questions like, could the military, even while laser focused on operations, truly safeguard the well-being of their own people?
It's more than just physical safety, right? We're talking about the mental and emotional toll, morale, the psychological impact of war. It's about that unwritten agreement between a country and the people it sends into harm's way.
Exactly, that covenant, that promise. The inquiry digs deep into how that was tested in Iraq, especially when it came to things like deployment length and the kind of support these soldiers could expect.
Which brings us to these harmony guidelines I keep hearing about.
Yeah, the Harmony Guidelines, these were a big deal.
These weren't just suggestions, were they?
Not at all.
Hmm.
These were meant to be like guarantees, for lack of a better word. Maximum time away from home on operations, what they called individual separated service. Then the downtime between deployments. It was all about finding some kind of balance between what the mission demanded and, the well-being of the soldiers. They were trying to prevent burnout, long-term damage, that kind of thing.
Makes sense. Being away from family, friends, everything familiar for months on end, and in a war zone no less, it would take a toll on anyone.
Absolutely. And the inquiry actually found that sticking to those Harmony Guidelines, it was vital in preventing long-term issues. PTSD, mental health stuff.
But they didn't always stick to them, did they?
That's the thing. Big but. They found those guidelines were broken more often than not.
The reality on the ground, right?
Exactly. Sometimes the mission just demanded more.
And when those harmony guidelines were broken, I'm guessing it wasn't pretty. Was it just morale that took a hit, or were there other consequences?
The inquiry heard firsthand how exceeding those limits, it was like a domino effect. Morale plummeted, retention rates suffered, and there was a surge in, you guessed it, mental health issues.
Do we know how often they had to break these guidelines?
At one point, almost 20%, nearly one-fifth of Army personnel were deployed beyond what those Harmony Guidelines recommended. And it wasn't just the Army. Even the RAF, especially those with very specialized roles, they were really feeling the pressure.
It really gives you a sense of how intense the pressure must have been. So how did the Ministry of Defense try to mitigate the human cost of this conflict, especially when it came to maintaining morale? What were they doing to try and keep these soldiers going?
One of the things they focused on was something called the Operational Welfare Package. It was all about trying to maintain a sense of normalcy, of connection to home, even in that very abnormal situation.
Okay, like care packages, but official.
In a way, yeah. Early on, it was about the essentials. Those welfare telephones, so soldiers could call home. Regular mail, getting those letters from loved ones. Access to news, so they could stay somewhat connected to what was happening back home. Even simple things like setting up a shop, so they had something resembling a normal routine.
It's amazing how much those little things, those links to home, can matter when you're in that kind of environment.
Huge. The inquiry, they found that even little hiccups, like mail delays, problems with the phones, it could really impact morale. They called them irritants.
Irritants? That seems like an understatement. Waiting weeks for a letter from your family when you're in a war zone, that's not just an irritant, it's gut-wrenching.
You're right. It just goes to show how something that seems like a minor inconvenience in our everyday lives can become this huge source of stress and anxiety in a war zone. Perspective is everything.
So they started with the basics. But this operational welfare package, it had to evolve, right? Especially as the conflict in Iraq dragged on.
Absolutely. As the war went on, the MOD realized they had to up their game. They expanded the welfare package to include more internet access, which I'm sure was a godsend for those serving, fitness equipment to help them blow off steam, better TV options, even free books. It became about more than just keeping them entertained. It was about their mental well-being.
Sounds like they were learning as they went, trying to strike that balance between practical needs and supporting the mental and emotional health of their soldiers.
Precisely. And it highlights a key takeaway here. Adaptability is crucial. What might seem like a luxury back home, in the middle of a war zone, it can be absolutely vital for morale and well-being.
It's a good reminder that even the best laid plans often go astray. And speaking of which, let's talk about the air bridge. That was the lifeline between the troops in Iraq and back home. What did the inquiry reveal about that aspect of the war?
This is where things get really interesting. By interesting, I mean kind of a logistical
Oh
nightmare.
no, what went
The
wrong?
main way British personnel got in and out of Iraq was on these RAF TriStar aircraft.
Okay.
And remember those specialized roles we talked about? The ones that were always in high demand?
The pinch point jobs.
Yeah, exactly. So getting those guys home for some much-needed R&R, it depended entirely on these TriStar flights.
Sounds like a single point of failure waiting to happen. What was the problem?
Planes break down. Delays happen.
Sure, but we're not talking about your typical flight delays here. The inquiry found out that these TriStars, they needed a very specific piece of equipment to operate safely in Iraqi airspace. The DAS, Defensive Aid Suite, it's called.
What does it do?
It's designed to protect the aircraft from ground-to-air missiles, which, kind of important in a war zone. The problem was there simply weren't enough DAS-equipped TriStars to meet the demand.
So they were stuck. They had this responsibility to get troops in and out, but also to keep them safe.
Precisely. And, well, that's where the real problems began.
So they're stuck with a serious air bridge problem. What'd they do? Throw their hands up in the air, give up?
Not quite. They tried to find workarounds, obviously. Explored chartering civilian aircraft, for one.
Interesting.
Thought about setting up these forward operating bases, closer to the action, shorten the flight times.
Makes sense.
They even considered just shortening the tour lengths for everyone across the board.
Wow, drastic measures.
Right.
Did any of it actually work?
Each of those solutions, well, they created their own problems, you see.
Ah, I see.
Bottom line, though, was that lack of a reliable way to get in and out of Iraq.
Hmm.
It had this huge ripple effect. Troops ended up stuck in Iraq longer than they were promised because they couldn't be rotated back home on schedule. Leave got disrupted. Families back home were left wondering when they'd see their loved ones again. And morale, well, you can imagine.
Yeah, I bet. You're already in a war zone, exhausted, missing your family, and then bam, you find out you're stuck there even longer. Brutal.
It really was. The inquiry concluded that the whole system for R&R was practically on the verge of collapse.
Because of the air bridge.
Entirely because of the air bridge.
Hmm.
It wasn't just about getting the troops back home either. Getting those fresh troops in, that was a problem too.
Wow. So this wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a serious operational challenge. Did the inquiry point fingers? Did they hold anyone accountable for this air bridge mess?
Oh, they didn't mince words, let me tell you that.
Hmm.
The House of Commons Defense Committee, they reviewed all the inquiry's findings, and they straight up called the situation unacceptable.
Ouch.
They were especially worried about, the Ministry of Defense's ability, or lack thereof really, to provide reliable transport for troops, especially those already serving beyond those Harmony guidelines we talked about.
Right, right. So it's a pretty serious public critique. What was this MOD's response? Did they try to fix it?
They did. They eventually, after much back and forth, ordered a fifth C-17 aircraft.
C-17.
Larger transport plane, much more modern.
Ah, so bigger, better, faster.
Exactly. But here's the thing. These things, they take time.
Ah.
The process of actually getting that new aircraft, it took years.
Years.
Bureaucracy at its finest.
It really highlights how these things can get bogged down even when there's an urgent need.
Absolutely. It's easy to forget about those real-world consequences when you're talking about policy and budgets and all that. But those delays, those bureaucratic hurdles, they translate into real-life challenges for the people on the ground. And speaking of those on the ground, we've talked a lot about the overall impact on morale, but I want to zoom in a bit. You mentioned those pinch point trades earlier, the ones hit hardest by these air bridge issues. The inquiry also looked at reservists, right? They must have had a whole other set of challenges to deal with.
Oh, absolutely. They were in a whole different category. Unlike the regular personnel, reservists were often deployed as individuals.
Individual.
Yeah, they'd be integrated into these existing regular units.
Wait, so they were basically being thrown into a new unit in a war zone, often with far less experience than everyone around them. Talk about being thrown in the deep end. How did they manage?
That's exactly what the inquiry wanted to know. Turns out, being scattered all over the place, it made it really difficult to give them the same level of support as the regular troops.
Logistically, right, making sure they had access to everything they needed.
Exactly.
Right.
Whether it was those operational welfare packages we talked about, or even just, time to decompress with other reservists, people who understood what they were going through, it was a real challenge.
I bet. And their families back home, they must have faced a unique set of challenges, too. These are people who had to put their civilian lives completely on hold, often with little to no warning.
Absolutely. And their families felt that impact acutely. The inquiry, they found that families of reservists, they often felt left in the dark. They didn't have the same level of support from the MOD.
So not only are the reservists themselves dealing with the pressure cooker of deployment, their families are back home feeling isolated and in the dark. It really underscores the far-reaching consequences of these conflicts, how they ripple outward. And what about the reservists' mental health? We talked about the impact of exceeding those harmony guidelines on regular troops, but were reservists at a higher risk for PTSD and other mental health issues?
Unfortunately, they were.
Hmm.
The inquiry found that, yeah, they were at a much higher risk for PTSD and other mental health challenges compared to their regular counterparts. They pointed to a couple of key factors.
Like what? What made them more susceptible?
Well, their lack of previous combat experience compared to the regular soldiers, that played a big role. And then there's the whole issue of unit cohesion, or rather the lack of it. Being the odd one out, the newbie, in a unit, especially in a war zone, it can lead to a real sense of isolation, which makes it that much harder to cope with the stress of everything they were experiencing.
So they're battling on multiple fronts, not just the enemy, but also these internal, often invisible challenges. Did the MOD do anything to address these unique challenges faced by reservists?
They did try to step up their game, started an enhanced post-operational mental health program designed specifically for reservists coming back from deployment.
It's good that they recognize the need for a more tailored approach, but the big question is, was it enough?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The inquiry, their findings suggested that, unfortunately, there was still a significant gap between what these reservists needed and what was actually being provided. And frankly, it's an issue that's still being grappled with today.
It makes you think about the long-term consequences, the invisible wounds that so many carry with them long after the guns have fallen silent. But even as we acknowledge those struggles, those ongoing challenges, we can't forget about those who never even got the chance to come home, those who paid the ultimate price. How did the MOD support those families, and what about the investigations into their deaths?
Those are heavy questions, and they deserve their own conversation. And that's exactly what we're going to do next.
All right, let's take a deep breath and dive into what is undoubtedly the most difficult and somber aspect of this inquiry, the loss of life. We're going to be looking at how the MOD handled the repatriation of those killed during Operation Telic, the investigations into their deaths, and support provided to those families left behind.
It's heavy stuff, no question. But it really gets to the heart of that covenant we keep talking about, the one between a nation and its soldiers. That promise to care for them, to support them, even in the face of unimaginable loss.
It's about honoring their sacrifice.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about those images we all saw in the news, those coffins draped in Union Jacks arriving back on British soil at RAF Braze Norton. It became such a powerful, somber symbol of the human cost of that war. Did the inquiry look into how those repatriation ceremonies were handled? Were they always conducted with that level of solemnity and respect?
It's interesting you bring that up because the inquiry actually highlighted a significant shift in how those repatriations were handled. Before the Iraq War, things were, well, for lack of a better word, quieter, more subdued, less ceremonial. But when the conflict in Iraq began, there was a definite shift towards more formal, more public displays of respect and mourning, which I think reflected a growing awareness of the need to honor those who had fallen in service to their country.
It was a recognition that these weren't just casualties, they were individuals, each with a story, each deeply mourned by families and communities.
Absolutely. And the inquiry actually documented how those ceremonies themselves evolved over time. They became more structured, more formalized, and they started to involve more public participation. Remember the route from RAF Braze Norton to the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford.
How could I forget? It seemed like every time I turned on the news, there was another procession.
That route, it became this focal point for public mourning. People would line the streets, standing shoulder to shoulder to pay their respects as the corteges went by.
Yeah.
And it was incredibly moving, to see that outpouring of grief and gratitude, even as the war itself remained so deeply divisive.
It highlighted that even amidst those heated debates about the war itself, there was a shared sense of loss, a recognition of the sacrifices these service members and their families had made. And speaking of families, I know the inquiry also looked at the individuals tasked with supporting those families through the unimaginable, the casualty notification officers and the visiting officers. What a heavy burden to carry, to be the one to deliver that news, to walk alongside those families during their darkest hour.
It's an incredibly tough job, emotionally and mentally. Imagine being that casualty notification officer, the CNO. They were the ones knocking on doors, delivering that life-altering news, being the face of the MOD in that moment of raw grief. And then the visiting officer, the VO, would step in, providing that ongoing support. They were there to help families navigate what was probably a bureaucratic maze, everything from funeral arrangements and financial matters to connecting them with support services, helping them find their footing in a world that had just been turned upside down.
I can't even begin to imagine what those CNOs and VOs were going through themselves, processing all that emotion, all that grief, on top of their already demanding jobs. Did the inquiry find that the MOD was providing adequate training to prepare these individuals for such a uniquely challenging role?
Well, that's where things get a little, shall we say, complicated. In the early days of the conflict, the training provided to CNOs and VOs was, well, less than ideal. A lot of it was on-the-job training, learning as you go, which, as you can imagine, wasn't really the best way to prepare someone for such an emotionally demanding task.
No, not at all. Especially when you think about the potential impact on those families. You'd want to make absolutely sure that every family, regardless of who their CNO or VO was receiving the same level of compassionate and consistent support.
Absolutely. Yeah, and thankfully, the inquiry recognized this as a serious issue. They came down pretty hard on the MOD, recommending that they implement a much more structured, mandatory training program for both CNOs and VOs to ensure that level of consistency and quality of care. They even went so far as to recommend that the MOD create a centralized training package specifically designed for those roles.
So, trying to standardize the process, make sure everyone was on the same page when it came to supporting grieving families. Did the MOD implement those recommendations?
They did, eventually. It took some time, but they did eventually roll out a more comprehensive training program for both CNOs and VOs, which was a step in the right direction for sure.
It sounds like they were at least trying to learn and adapt as they went, even if it was sometimes in response to criticism or tragedy. But the work of the CNOs and the VOs, those were just the initial stages, right? We also have to talk about the investigations into the deaths themselves. How did the MOD handle that incredibly sensitive and complex process?
That's where things get even more complicated because now we're talking about a war zone. And conducting those kinds of investigations in that environment, gathering evidence, securing scenes, it was incredibly difficult and often very dangerous. The MOD relied heavily on something called a Board of Inquiry, or BOI, as their primary tool for investigating military deaths in Iraq.
BOIs. Okay, break that down for me. What exactly were these boards looking for? Were they trying to find someone to blame when a soldier was killed?
Not exactly. Their primary objective wasn't about pointing fingers or making judgments. It was about trying to establish a clear and accurate account of what happened. Think of it as a fact-finding mission. They'd examine everything leading up to a death, analyze contributing factors, interview witnesses if possible, and then compile a detailed report on what transpired.
So more about establishing the facts, the sequence of events, than pointing fingers?
Exactly. But even with that seemingly straightforward objective, the inquiry found that the BOI process often became bogged down in bureaucracy. It was slow, it was frustrating, especially for families who were just desperate for answers about what had happened to their loved ones.
Understandably so. And that's never an easy process, but in a war zone, it must have been incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to conduct those kinds of investigations in a timely manner. What were some of the key factors that led to these delays, these bureaucratic bottlenecks that the families were so frustrated by?
Well, you have to remember the context. This was Iraq. It was incredibly volatile, dangerous. Just getting to the location of an incident, securing the area, gathering evidence, all of that was incredibly challenging and dangerous for those involved.
Right, it's not like investigating a car accident back home. You're talking about a war zone where every movement could have life or death consequences.
Precisely. And then you have to factor in the added complexity of dealing with another country's military. The inquiry found that getting cooperation from U.S. forces, particularly when those incidents involved U.S. troops, was often a real challenge, and that lack of cooperation inevitably led to delays.
Which is understandable to a point. Different countries have different rules, different procedures. But at the same time, you have these families who are absolutely desperate for answers, for some sense of closure, and they're caught in the middle. It's heartbreaking.
Did the inquiry address this issue of communication with the families? Were those families kept informed about the investigations? That's another area where they found the MOD lacking. At least in the early years of the conflict, communication with families about the progress of these investigations was, well, it was patchy at best. Families were often left in the dark, unsure of what was happening, what the timelines were, and it just compounded their grief, their sense of helplessness.
It's like adding insult to injury, isn't it? Not only have they lost someone they love, but they're kept in the dark, left to wonder what happened if they'll ever get answers. What did the MOD do to address this lack of communication?
Well, in direct response to those criticisms from the inquiry, the MOD created a new unit within the Army. They called it the Army Investigations and Aftercare Support Cell, AISC for short.
Catchy. What did this AIASC actually do? What was their role?
Their main job was to oversee the BOI process. But crucially, they acted as a single point of contact for families. Think of them as advocates. They're to help families navigate the often confusing and overwhelming world of military bureaucracy. The AIAC would keep them informed, provide them with updates, make sure they weren't lost in the shuffle, and perhaps most importantly, they implemented a system of regular progress reports that were shared directly with the families, so they had a clearer understanding of what was happening, how the investigation was progressing, and what to expect.
It sounds like a step in the right direction, at least. A recognition that those families deserve to be kept in the loop, to be active participants in the process rather than passive bystanders. But these BOIs, these initial investigations, they weren't the end of the road, were they? We also have to talk about the inquests, the separate legal proceedings that happened back in the UK.
Right, and it's important to keep in mind that the BOIs, while thorough, they weren't legal proceedings. Inquests, on the other hand, they were. These were formal legal inquiries conducted by a coroner to officially determine the cause of death, and they were mandatory for every single military fatality in Iraq. But as you mentioned, those inquests presented their own set of challenges for the families.
Like what? What made these inquests so difficult, so different for these families already carrying so much?
Well, one of the biggest sticking points was simply the location. Because the bodies of those killed in Iraq were flown back to the UK through RAF Bryce Norton, the vast majority of those inquests were held in Oxfordshire. And of course, this was hugely problematic for families who lived elsewhere in the UK.
I can see how that would be a huge burden. Traveling across the country for a funeral, for that one solemn occasion, is one thing. But to have to make that journey repeatedly, potentially for months on end, to attend these inquest hearings that could drag on with delays and postponements, it's an incredible strain emotionally and financially on those families.
It was. And to make matters worse, families were often expected to navigate those complex legal proceedings, the ins and outs of the inquest process, without proper legal representation. Meanwhile, the MOD, they usually had lawyers present, there to represent their interests.
Wait, hold on. You're telling me that the MOD, a government entity with vast resources, had legal representation, but the families, the ones who were already going through hell, were expected to fend for themselves in this complex legal system. That doesn't seem right.
It wasn't. And the inquiry agreed. They very strongly recommended that families be given access to independent legal advice and representation. They even went so far as to suggest that the MOD should cover the cost, recognizing the financial burden those families were already under.
Just basic fairness, really. Making sure those families had someone in their corner who understood the law, who could advocate for their needs, help them make sense of what was happening. Did the MOD agree to provide that legal support?
It wasn't an easy sell. The government at the time, their stance was that legal aid wasn't typically provided for inquests because they were supposed to be inquisitorial, not adversarial. Their argument was that it wasn't a trial, so families didn't need lawyers.
Right, but that ignores the inherent power imbalance. You have the MOD with all its resources, its legal experts, and then you have these families, many of them still reeling from their loss, expected to navigate this on their own.
Exactly. But thankfully, due in no small part to the families themselves, those who spoke out and shared their experiences, to the MPs who recognized the injustice of the situation, and even to some coroners who saw firsthand how this lack of representation impacted the process, that policy was eventually changed.
It's a good reminder that even when the odds seem stacked against you, sometimes raising your voice, sharing your story, demanding better, it can lead to real change. Were there any other challenges related to the inquest process that the inquiry uncovered?
One of the most contentious issues revolved around the involvement, or rather the lack of involvement, of U.S. personnel in these inquests, particularly in those cases where U.S. forces were directly involved. The U.S. government, as you might imagine, was notoriously reluctant to allow their personnel to be questioned in foreign courts, citing concerns about national security and potential legal issues.
And I can see how that would be a point of contention. On the one hand, you have national security concerns. On the other, you have families who are grieving, who are trying to piece together what happened, why they lost their loved ones. And if the key piece of the puzzle is being withheld because of jurisdictional issues or whatever, it just creates more questions, more pain.
Exactly. And it led to some very public clashes. There were several high-profile cases where coroners presiding over those inquests publicly criticized the U.S. government for not cooperating, arguing that this lack of transparency was hindering their ability to uncover the truth.
It highlights the complexity of conducting these investigations, these inquests, against the backdrop of a war that involves so many different countries, each with its own rules and procedures. But even beyond the legal processes, the BOIs, and the inquests, I'm curious about the broader efforts to honor those who died in Iraq, the memorials, the tributes. How did the inquiry's findings impact those aspects of remembrance?
That's an important distinction you make because true remembrance goes beyond just investigations and legal proceedings. It's about recognizing the human cost, ensuring that those sacrifices are never forgotten, that their stories continue to be told.
So, how did the inquiry influence those efforts to create lasting memorials?
Well, one of the most notable outcomes, at least symbolically, was the creation of the Elizabeth Cross.
Ah, yes. The medal that is given to the next of kin of British Armed Forces personnel who have died on operations or as a result of terrorism.
Exactly. It was established in 2009, and the timing wasn't coincidental. Part of the impetus for its creation came directly from the inquiry's findings and their emphasis on the need to do more to recognize the sacrifices of these families. It's a lasting tribute, a way to honor those who have given their lives in service to their country.
A powerful symbol of remembrance. Were there other tangible efforts, other ways in which the MOD tried to create these lasting tributes to those lost?
There were. One that stands out is the memorial wall that was initially erected at the British base in Basra. It was a simple but incredibly moving tribute. Just a wall with the names of every single British service member who died in Iraq inscribed on it. And then when the British forces withdrew from Basra, they made the decision to carefully dismantle that wall, bring it all the way back to the UK, and then reassemble it, rededicate it in a very moving ceremony. It really speaks to the enduring legacy of the Iraq War and its profound impact on those who served and their families.
It's a complicated legacy, for sure. Full of triumph and tragedy, moments of incredible courage, and moments of unimaginable loss. And as we've seen, the MOD, often playing catch-up, struggled to keep pace with the demands of this conflict, to maintain morale, to provide adequate support, to investigate deaths thoroughly and compassionately. But I think you've hit on something really important here. There's a bigger question, a more profound question, that looms over all of this.
And it's a question that transcends this particular conflict, this particular inquiry. It's a question we have to ask ourselves as a society. What do we owe to those who serve? How do we support them, not just during their time in uniform, but also after they come home, bearing the visible and invisible scars of war? How do we honor those sacrifices in a way that truly matters?
Those are questions that deserve more than just lip service. They require a real commitment, a sustained effort, to understanding the true cost of war, to learning from the experiences of those who have borne the brunt of that burden, to demanding better for them, always. The stories we've explored today, they're just a starting point, a glimpse into the lives forever changed by this conflict. It's up to all of us to ensure those sacrifices are never forgotten and that those who serve receive the care, the compassion, and the opportunities they deserve, both during their service and long after they've taken off the uniform.
I couldn't agree more. This isn't a conversation that ends when the last troops come home or the last report is filed away. It's an ongoing dialogue, an ongoing obligation to remember, to learn, and to demand better.
This deep dive has been a difficult one, but it's so important that we engage in these conversations, that we don't shy away from the hard truths. The Iraq War, like all conflicts, left an indelible mark on those who served and their families. It's a legacy we're all responsible for understanding and honoring.